I parked my Civic at the gravel lot entrance of Acadia Marina. 10 minutes early for the interview. The car's frame settled with a creak when I cut the engine. Maine coastal wind carried the smell of salt and diesel through my cracked window. My wallet held $27 and a maxed-out credit card, my entire financial cushion after 3 months of rejections. The Marina office sat at the end of a long dock stretching into the harbor. Behind it rose a white 2-story house on the hillside, windows reflecting orange in the setting sun. I checked my watch, 6:50, then pulled my only decent button up straight and walked down the wooden planks. My shoes made hollow sounds against the weathered boards. A bell jangled when I pushed open the door. The office smelled like old coffee and marine varnish. Nautical charts covered most of one wall, fishing licenses and Coast Guard certificates the other. A man stood behind the counter sorting through a stack of invoices. "Daniel Clark?" I asked. He looked up. White hair thinned at the crown of his head, but thick eyebrows shadowed alert eyes. Skin weathered like old leather, 70, maybe older. "Thomas Mitchell?" His voice had the coarse texture of someone who'd spent decades shouting over boat engines. When I nodded, he checked his watch. "You're early. Good sign." He gestured toward a back room. "Office is this way." The inner office was smaller, walls lined with filing cabinets topped by stacks of folders and technical manuals. A desk dominated the center, its surface buried under paperwork, coffee mugs, and what looked like marine radio parts. Daniel settled into a chair that protested under his weight and pointed to a metal folding chair across from him. "Resume?" he asked. I handed him the single page I'd printed at the library. He scanned it without comment, his thumbnail tapping against the edge. "Not much night work experience," he said. "I worked closing shifts at Johnson's Hardware for 2 years," I replied. "Store didn't close until 11, then inventory and cleanup till midnight." He nodded, set the resume down. "Position simple. Night watchman, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 7 nights a week if you want them, or we can arrange some nights off. Pay is $100 per shift, cash." I calculated quickly. $700 a week, more than enough to cover rent and start rebuilding my savings. Too good to be true for essentially just staying awake overnight. "What would my duties include?" I asked, trying to hide my eagerness. "Keep an eye on the boats, check moorings, make sure nobody's stealing equipment or getting where they shouldn't." He opened a drawer and pulled out a flashlight, setting it on the desk. "Hourly patrols. There's a logbook in the main office to sign. Between patrols, you can watch TV, read, whatever keeps you awake." I nodded. "Sounds straightforward." "It is, with a few rules." He picked up a pencil and pulled a yellow legal pad toward him. The pencil scratched against the paper as he wrote. When he finished, he tore off the sheet and pushed it across the desk. 4 rules, non-negotiable. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical. 1. Never respond to calls for help from the water. 2. Follow patrol route exactly as shown on map 3. Do not engage with red-haired woman if encountered. 4. Avoid eye contact with anyone whose eyes seem unusual. I read them twice, feeling my eyebrows rise. "These are specific." Daniel leaned back in his chair. The springs squeaked. "First rule is liability. Drunk tourists fall in the harbor all the time. You're not trained for water rescue. You call Coast Guard, they handle it. Second rule." He tapped the paper. "Keeps you from disturbing boat owners who sleep on their vessels. Third rule, there's a woman with red hair. Local, violent history. Threatened my last night guy with a knife when he wouldn't let her sleep in one of the boats. And the fourth," he shrugged, "this close to Bar Harbor, we get all kinds. People on drugs have those big pupils. Best to avoid them altogether." Each explanation sounded reasonable enough in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern that should have worried me more than it did. But the alternative was another month of job applications and watching my bank account shrink to nothing. "I can follow rules," I said. He studied me for a long moment. then nodded once. When can you start? Tonight, if you need me to. Tomorrow's better. I'll show you the patrol route in the morning, 10 o'clock. I stood and extended my hand. His grip was firm, calloused. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Clark. Daniel's fine. He released my hand. One more thing. The house up there is mine. If there's ever trouble you can't handle, my bedroom light's on the second floor, east side. Flash your light at the window 3 times, I'll come down. The first night passed slowly. Daniel had walked me through the patrol route that morning, down the main dock, check each finger pier, circle the maintenance shed, pass by the fuel station, then back to the office. 20 minutes, if I moved at a comfortable pace. The logbook had columns for time, weather conditions, and notes. Hourly patrols, he'd said. First at 11 p.m. when you start, last at 6 a.m. before shift end. Write down anything unusual. The office had a small television, a mini fridge, and a comfortable office chair. Between patrols, I alternated between watching late-night shows and reading a paperback I'd brought. The clock on the wall ticked loudly enough to hear over the gentle slap of water against the docks. The second night was the same, and the third. By the fourth night, I'd settled into a routine. Check the time, grab the flashlight, walk the route, note the quiet boats and still water, return to the office. The work was easy money, almost boring. On the fifth night, I passed a fisherman on the dock around 2 a.m. He nodded without speaking. I returned the gesture and continued my patrol. That was the extent of my human interaction all week. The seventh night started like the others. I arrived at 10:45, changed into the windbreaker I'd started keeping at the office, and prepared for my shift. The weather had turned cooler, mist hanging over the harbor and condensing on the wooden rails. My first patrol took exactly 19 minutes. I noted light fog, all secure in the logbook. At 1:17 in the morning during my third patrol, I heard it, a woman's voice calling from the dark water beyond the furthest dock. Help, please, somebody help me. The voice echoed across the still harbor, desperate and clear despite the distance. I stopped at the end of the main dock, my flashlight beam cutting ineffectually into the fog over the black water. The first rule echoed in my head as loudly as the woman's cries. I'm drowning, please, anyone! I stood frozen, my hand tightening around the flashlight. Every instinct told me to help, to call back, to do something. But Daniel's rule was clear. Another cry rippled across the water, closer this time. I backed away 2 steps, then turned and walked quickly to the office. Inside, I picked up the phone and dialed 911. Coast Guard, Bar Harbor Station, I said when the operator answered. Possible person in distress in the water near Acadia Marina. After I hung up, I returned to the dock entrance but went no further. The cries continued, growing more frantic. I checked my watch repeatedly. 23 minutes later, the distinctive chug of a Coast Guard boat approached through the fog, searchlights sweeping the harbor in wide arcs. I raised my arm and flagged them down, pointing toward where I'd last heard the voice. The woman's cries had stopped the moment their engine became audible. You reported a person in the water? The officer's voice carried clearly over the idling engine. Yes, female voice calling for help from that direction, I called back, pointing southeast of the marina. The Coast Guard boat moved methodically through the area for 30 minutes, searchlight cutting through fog. Finally, they returned to where I stood. Nothing out there, the officer said. No boats reported missing persons either. I heard her clearly, I insisted, calling for help, saying she was drowning. The officer nodded, unsurprised. Happens pretty often. Sound carries weird over water, especially in fog. Could have been someone on shore or teenagers messing around. Maybe even a loon. They can sound human sometimes. I thanked him, knowing I hadn't mistaken a bird call for a woman's voice. The Coast Guard boat pulled away, leaving me alone again on the dock. In the office, I noted the incident in the logbook. My hand shook slightly as I wrote. For the rest of the shift, I left the television off, listening for any sound from the harbor. None came. Dawn arrived with relief. I watched the sun rise through the office window, turning the water from black to gray to blue. When Daniel arrived to relieve me, I hesitated before mentioning what had happened. "Heard someone calling for help from the water last night," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Called the Coast Guard like you said." Daniel looked at me for a long moment, his expression unchanged. "They find anything?" "No." He nodded once. "Good." Then, after a pause, "You did right, following the rules." I drove home in the morning light, replaying the woman's cries in my head. The desperation had sounded genuine. The Coast Guard's explanation made logical sense, but didn't feel right. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I realized I was already dreading the coming night's shift in a way I hadn't before. Sometimes a paycheck comes with costs you don't anticipate. I was about to learn exactly how high those costs could go. The woman's voice carried over the water again, clearer this time. "Please, I can't swim much longer." My hand hovered over the office phone. 15 minutes since the first cry. Each one sounded closer to shore. I'd already written "distress call from water" in the logbook with the time, 2:17, and my response followed protocol, called authorities. "Help me. Please, anybody." The desperate edge in her voice hit something primal in my chest. I stood up twice, paced the small office, and sat back down. Daniel's first rule seemed cruel now. Maybe there really was someone out there. Maybe the Coast Guard would be too late. I pressed my palms against the desk. A boat slipping its mooring, I told myself. A drunk tourist who'd missed the last water taxi, not my responsibility. The rules existed for a reason. The 911 dispatcher had sounded concerned when I called. "We'll contact the Coast Guard right away," she'd said, taking down the details of my location and the situation. 20 minutes passed by the wall clock's steady tick before I heard the deep rumble of the Coast Guard vessel. I grabbed my flashlight and windbreaker and stepped outside. The late October air bit through my clothes, dense with salt and the promise of rain. Fog had thickened since my last patrol, hanging in milky layers across the harbor. The searchlight swept methodically over the water's surface, creating moving shadows as it cut through the mist. I walked to the end of the main dock, careful to maintain my footing on the damp boards. The beam from my flashlight barely penetrated 20 feet into the fog. "Over here," I called, waving my light. The Coast Guard vessel adjusted course, its engine throttling down as it approached. A uniformed officer stood at the bow, hand resting on the gunwale. "Location of the distress call?" he asked, voice professional but lacking urgency. I pointed southeast. "That direction." Woman's voice. Started maybe half a mile out but sounded closer before you arrived. He nodded and spoke into his radio. The boat moved off, searchlight creating a bright cone through the fog as they executed a standard search pattern. I stayed at the dock's edge, scanning the water nearest to me. The surface looked like black glass, broken only by the gentle lapping against the pilings. After 30 minutes by my watch, the Coast Guard boat returned. The same officer leaned over the side. "Nothing out there," he said. "Water temperature's 42 degrees. If someone went in without a survival suit, they'd have about 20 minutes before hypothermia set in." "I heard her clearly," I said. "Multiple times over about 45 minutes." The officer adjusted his cap. "Sound carries weird over water, especially in fog. Could have been someone on shore. Might have been a loon. They can sound remarkably human. I'd heard loons before. This was no bird." "We get calls like this every couple months," he continued. "Usually turns out to be nothing." I thanked him and watched the boat pull away, its running lights small red and green dots that disappeared into the fog. Back in the office, I added to my logbook entry, "Coast Guard search. Negative results." The clock read 3:10 a.m. The television's laugh track felt wrong after what I'd heard, so I turned it off. For the remainder of my shift, I kept the exterior lights on and checked the window between paragraphs of my paperback. The cries didn't return. Morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through thinning fog. I completed my final patrol at 6:45 a.m., noting all secure in the log, despite the hollowness of the words. When Daniel arrived at 7:03, I hesitated before mentioning what happened. "Heard someone calling for help from the water last night," I said, keeping my voice level. "Called 911 like the rules say." Daniel hung his jacket on the hook by the door. His face remained impassive. "They find anything?" "No." He nodded once. "Good." Then, after checking the logbook, "You did right, following the rules." The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it left me with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. I slept poorly that day. My dreams filled with a woman's voice calling my name from somewhere I couldn't reach. By evening, I'd convinced myself I'd heard exactly what the Coast Guard officer suggested. Natural sounds distorted by water and fog. Nothing more. The next night started quietly. I arrived at 10:40 for my shift, checked the dock lines on the nearest vessels during my 11 p.m. patrol, and settled in with a fresh paperback. The fog had cleared, replaced by a sharp-edged clarity that often follows poor weather. Stars pinned the sky in cold patterns, and a three-quarter moon cast enough light to make the water gleam. My midnight patrol went smoothly. 1:15 rolled around, and I pushed away the memory of last night's cries as I began my rounds. The dock boards creaked beneath my boots, weathered wood silvered by moonlight. I followed the exact route Daniel had shown me: main dock, finger piers, maintenance shed, fuel station, then back. The temperature had dropped enough that my breath formed small clouds. Wind chimes on someone's sailboat rang softly from the outer mooring field. My watch showed 2:16 when I reached the fuel dock. One more checkpoint, then back to the office. I swept my flashlight across the still water, catching the reflection of mooring buoys like small floating eyes. At exactly 2:17, the voice returned. "Help me, please." Weaker than yesterday, not shouting now, but pleading. Close to shore, perhaps 50 yards beyond the end of the dock. I flicked my flashlight off and waited, heart drumming against my ribs. I can't hold on much longer. Every instinct told me to call out, to run back for the life ring mounted on the fuel shed. Instead, I found myself walking slowly toward the voice, feet moving almost against my will. The dock ended in a small platform with cleats for transient vessels. I stopped there, straining to see through the darkness. Something pale broke the water's surface. A hand, maybe. An arm. Then more. A figure floated face up in the moonlight, 30 yards from where I stood. Female shape. Long hair spreading around her head like dark seaweed. Her arms extended outward, making slow, circular motions that weren't quite right for treading water. I reached for the flashlight clipped to my belt, hands clumsy with cold or fear. The beam caught her fully, and several wrongnesses registered at once. Her skin was too white, almost luminescent. Her movements weren't desperate thrashing, but deliberate, rhythmic patterns. And her face. She turned toward my light, eyes open, smiling. Our gazes locked for 3 endless seconds. Her smile widened into something that stretched too far across her face, revealing teeth that gleamed too sharply in the moonlight. Then she sank, not thrashing or gasping, but smoothly, deliberately, without disturbing the water's surface. No bubbles, no splash. Nothing but spreading ripples that caught the moonlight like silver coins. I backpedaled, nearly tripping over a coiled rope. My heel caught the edge of the dock, and I windmilled my arms to keep from falling backward. By the time I regained my balance, I was already running, boots loud against the wooden planks. Back in the office, I slammed the door and twisted the deadbolt. My breath came in shallow bursts that fogged the window as I peered out at the harbor. Nothing moved on the water's surface. No sound but the distant clang of a channel marker and my own pulse in my ears. I picked up the phone, finger hovering over the keypad. Who would I call? What would I say? I'd seen... What? A swimmer? A corpse? Something else entirely? I replaced the receiver and pulled my chair away from the windows, positioning it against the far wall. For the remainder of my shift, I left all the lights on and made my hourly patrol entries without leaving the office. Each one read the same. All secure. No activity. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When it finally arrived, painting the eastern sky in thin bands of pink and gold, I stepped outside for my final patrol. The harbor looked ordinary in the growing light, fishing boats bobbing gently at their moorings, gulls wheeling overhead, the distant chug of the first lobster boat heading out for the day. But I couldn't shake the image of that smile or the unnatural way she'd sunk beneath the surface. I completed my rounds quickly, eyes scanning the water for any sign of disturbance. There was none. Daniel arrived at 7 sharp. I didn't mention what I'd seen. Something told me he already knew, and I wasn't ready for whatever explanation he might offer. Instead, I handed over the logbook with its carefully edited entries and headed for my car. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Daniel stood at the end of the dock, looking out over the water. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders. He knew something about this place that I didn't. Something contained in those 4 simple rules that suddenly didn't seem arbitrary at all. I should have quit that morning. Should have found another job, no matter how desperate my finances. But $700 a week kept me coming back, and I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Natural phenomena, trick of the light, exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. I was wrong, of course. The harbor held secrets darker than I could imagine, and I was about to learn exactly what they were. I adjusted my shift pattern the following night. Instead of starting patrols on the hour, I pushed everything back 60 minutes. The woman in the water had appeared at exactly 2:17 for 2 consecutive nights. Moving my schedule meant I'd be safely in the office during that window. My watch read 11:58 when I began my first patrol. The temperature had dropped to the low 30s overnight, leaving a thin skin of frost on the dock railings. Each board creaked under my weight, the sound sharper in the cold air. I kept my flashlight beam low, sweeping it in methodical arcs across the weathered planks. The marina felt emptier than usual. Most seasonal boaters had pulled their vessels for winter storage, leaving only the year-round fishing boats and a handful of covered sailboats. My breath formed small clouds that dissolved into darkness. The moon sat 3/4 full, bright enough to cast shadows across the dock. I'd completed about half my route when I saw her. A woman stood at the end of the main dock, perfectly still, her back to me. Long red hair cascaded down her coat, vivid even in the monochrome moonlight. Something about her posture felt wrong, too rigid. Like a photograph of a person rather than a person herself. Daniel's 3rd rule burned in my mind. Do not engage with red-haired woman if encountered. I slowed my pace, considering my options. The dock was too narrow to go around her. Turning back meant abandoning my patrol route, violating Rule 2. I continued forward, planning to pass her with a professional nod and nothing more. 20 feet away, she turned. Her movements were fluid but oddly timed, like someone had removed frames from a film. Her face caught the moonlight, pretty in a conventional way, with a scatter of freckles across pale skin. She smiled, teeth very white against the darkness. "Excuse me," she called, voice warm and friendly. "Do you know what time the gas station closes?" I kept walking, eyes fixed on a point past her shoulder. My right hand tightened around the flashlight, thumb resting on the switch in case I needed the beam. "Hello?" she said, voice pitched higher. "I'm talking to you." 3 more steps brought me parallel with her. The air temperature seemed to drop further. A scent like copper and seaweed rolled off her clothes. "Hey." Her tone shifted, friendly veneer cracking. "What time does the gas station close? It's a simple question." I maintained my pace, refusing to look directly at her. The end of the dock lay 15 feet ahead. Once past her, I could circle back to the office via the maintenance shed route. "Are you fucking deaf?" The warmth in her voice vanished completely, replaced by something razor-edged. "I asked you a question." I heard footsteps behind me, her boots on the wooden planks, following, not running, but walking with purpose. "You're being incredibly rude," she said, closer now. "I'm going to report you to your boss. What's your name?" "Hey, I'm talking to you." I quickened my pace, focusing on the junction ahead where the main dock met the walkway leading to the maintenance area. Her footsteps accelerated to match mine. "You think you're better than me?" Her voice dropped an octave, taking on a rough quality that scraped against my ears. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." I broke into a jog, no longer concerned with appearing professional. Her footsteps matched my pace exactly, though they sounded wrong somehow, too light for someone running on wooden boards. "You don't ignore me!" she screamed, the sound echoing across the still harbor. "Nobody ignores me!" Something whistled past my ear and clattered onto the dock ahead, a brass cleat torn from one of the mooring posts. I glanced back to spite myself. She stood 20 feet behind me, her face transformed by rage. In the moonlight, her features seemed to shift and flow, like wax held too close to a flame. I ran. No pretense now, just raw flight response. Behind me, her boots hammered the dock in pursuit. Something hard struck my left shoulder blade, another projectile. Pain bloomed between my shoulders, but I didn't slow down. The office loomed ahead, its windows glowing with the security lights I'd left on. I fumbled the keys from my pocket, hands shaking as I rammed the correct one into the lock. The door swung inward just as another object, a rock or piece of metal, smashed into the frame beside my head. I slammed the door shut and twisted the deadbolt. The impact of her body hitting the other side rattled the entire frame. The door shuddered against its hinges. Pounds and kicks followed, hard enough to make the windows vibrate. "Open this door!" Her voice didn't sound human anymore, too deep, too layered, like multiple people speaking in ragged unison. "I'll make you pay for ignoring me." I backed away from the door, bumping against the desk. The assault continued, punctuated by curses and threats that became increasingly creative and anatomically impossible. Something sharp scraped down the door's exterior, nails or claws that left audible grooves in the wood. For 15 minutes by the wall clock, she raged outside. I stood motionless, eyes fixed on the door, phone clutched in my hand but uncertain who to call. What would I tell the police? That a woman was angry because I wouldn't tell her when the gas station closed. Eventually, the pounding stopped. Silence fell so suddenly it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. I crept to the window and peered through a gap in the blinds. She stood in the parking lot, perfectly still again, face turned toward my window. Even from 30 yards away, I could feel her stare. She raised one hand slowly and pointed directly at me, then made a slicing motion across her throat. After that, she began walking. Not toward the road or the docks, but in a wide circle around the office building. Her stride was measured, deliberate. She completed 2 full circuits, never taking her eyes off the windows. Then she turned and walked straight toward the water's edge. I watched, unable to look away, as she stepped off the dock into the harbor. There was no splash. One moment she stood on the wooden planks. The next, the water's surface rippled as if accepting something familiar. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and dialed Daniel's number. 4 rings, then voicemail. "Daniel, it's Thomas," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "There was a woman with red hair on the dock tonight. I swallowed hard. She wanted information. When I didn't answer, she followed me. threw things, hit the door for 15 minutes straight. I paused, debating how much to share. She went into the water afterward, just walked in and disappeared. Call me back when you get this. I lowered the phone and looked at my watch. 1:32. Still hours until sunrise. The shoulder where she'd hit me throbbed dully. I pulled off my jacket and shirt to examine it in the bathroom mirror. An angry red welt had already formed, with a small puncture at its center, where whatever she'd thrown had broken the skin. I cleaned it with soap and water, then covered it with a bandage from the first aid kit under the sink. Back in the main office, I pulled the chair away from the windows and positioned it against the far wall. For the remainder of my shift, I recorded all secure in the logbook at hourly intervals without conducting a single patrol. Some rules, I was learning, protected you from far more than liability issues or knife-wielding locals. The question was whether I'd live long enough to understand exactly what those rules were keeping at bay. I found Daniel's note folded under the office door when I arrived at 10:45 that night. The small slip of paper had been torn from the same yellow legal pad where he'd written the 4 rules my first day. You did the right thing. Trust the rules. 8 words in Daniel's blocky handwriting. No signature needed. I slipped the note into my pocket, strangely reassured by this small acknowledgement. At least I wasn't imagining things. At least Daniel knew something about what was happening here. The wall clock read 11:12. I checked the logbook entries from the day shift, routine maintenance notes, a fuel delivery, 2 transient vessels that had departed before sundown. Normal Marina business that made the events of the past 2 nights seem distant, almost imaginary. My first patrol started at midnight. I'd adjusted the route to keep me within sprinting distance of the office at all times. The thermometer mounted outside the window read 29 degrees, cold enough that my breath formed clouds that hung in the still air before dissipating. Frost had already formed on the dock railings, turning the metal white under my flashlight beam. Something felt different about the marina tonight. The usual harbor sounds, water lapping against hulls, the distant clang of mooring chains, wind through rigging, seemed muted, as if heard through cotton. Even my footsteps on the wooden planks landed with a deadened thud, instead of the usual hollow echo. The sky had cleared completely, stars sharp as pinpricks above. No moon yet. It would rise later, according to the tide chart posted in the office. I followed my modified route, keeping the office building in sight as I checked the nearest finger piers. The stillness felt wrong. No wind, no waves. The harbor's surface lay flat as polished stone, reflecting the stars in perfect mirror image. Twice I stopped to listen, hearing nothing but my own breathing and the soft click of the flashlight switch as I adjusted my grip. I reached the fuel dock at 12:22. One more section to check, then back to the safety of the office. My flashlight beam swept across the weathered planks, catching a pair of boot heel marks that hadn't been there during yesterday's patrol. Someone had visited the fuel dock recently, leaving scuffs in the thin layer of frost. A movement at the dock's end caught my attention, a shadow shifting against the greater darkness beyond. I raised my flashlight, ready to announce myself as security, when I made out a human figure sitting at the far end of the pier, legs dangling over the edge, back to me, shoulders hunched slightly as if relaxed. Must be one of the local fishermen, I thought. They sometimes came down at odd hours to check their boats or prepare for early departures. I'd encountered a few during previous shifts. Taciturn men who nodded acknowledgement but rarely spoke. "Evening," I called, keeping my voice professional. "Just doing my security rounds." The figure didn't turn immediately. Something about its stillness raised the hairs on my neck. I took another step forward, duty overriding instinct. "Sir, everything all right out here?" The head turned then, a motion too smooth to be natural, like a machine designed to approximate human movement, but not quite succeeding. The face remained in shadow, features indistinct except for a crescent of reflected light where the eyes should be. "Beautiful night for a swim," the figure said, male voice, but wrong somehow, pitched slightly too high, with an undertone like metal grinding against metal. I stopped 15 feet away, suddenly remembering Daniel's 4th rule: avoid eye contact with anyone whose eyes seem unusual. The figure stood in one fluid motion, turning to face me fully. My flashlight beam caught him straight on, and my stomach dropped. His eyes were enormous, taking up nearly half his face, reflecting my light with an unnatural silver sheen like a deer caught in headlights. No pupils, just mirrored discs that threw my light back at me with increased intensity. His mouth stretched into a smile that revealed too many teeth, each one pointed like a small knife. "Join me?" he asked, extending one hand toward me. His fingers looked too long, the joints positioned wrong. "The water's perfect tonight." I stepped backward, keeping the light trained on him but avoiding those mirror-like eyes. "No thanks. Just finishing my patrol." "It'll be fun," he insisted, voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly across the distance between us. "Everyone's waiting down there. The woman with the pretty red hair asked for you specifically." My back foot slipped on a patch of frost, nearly sending me sprawling. I caught myself on a piling, heart hammering against my ribs. "I really need to finish my rounds," I said, continuing to back away. "Enjoy your evening." His smile widened impossibly, splitting his face almost ear to ear. "We'll see you soon enough, Watchman. Rules can only protect you for so long." I turned and walked quickly toward the main dock, fighting the urge to run. My boots struck the wooden planks with dull thuds that seemed too quiet in the unnatural stillness. Behind me I heard nothing, no footsteps, no splashing, no movement at all. Only when the office door closed behind me did I allow myself to breathe normally again. Through the window I could see the fuel dock clearly in the starlight. Empty now, no sign of the figure with the silver eyes. I pulled out my cell phone and scrolled through my contacts. Rob Torres had been a year ahead of me in high school, not a close friend, but someone I'd kept loose contact with over the years. He'd joined the Bar Harbor Police Department right after community college. We occasionally exchanged text messages about fishing spots or local sports teams. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "Torres." "Rob, it's Thomas Mitchell. Sorry to call so late." "Tom, everything okay?" Professional concern, but with the undertone of familiarity. "I'm working security at Acadia Marina, and there's someone suspicious hanging around the fuel dock. Might be nothing, but..." I hesitated, unsure how to describe what I'd seen without sounding unhinged. "Want me to swing by?" "I'm on patrol tonight. Just finishing a coffee break at the all-night place on Cedar. If you wouldn't mind, just to check the perimeter. Probably nothing, but better safe than sorry." "Be there in 15, he said. "Stay inside until I arrive." I didn't need to be told twice. I kept watch through the window, scanning the docks with methodical sweeps. Nothing moved on the flat, mirror-like surface of the harbor. The fuel dock remained empty, frost untouched where the figure had been standing. Rob's patrol car pulled into the gravel lot 13 minutes later, headlights sweeping across the office before he cut the engine. I met him at the door, relieved to see the familiar face despite the years since high school. He'd filled out since then, his frame solid beneath the dark blue uniform. "Thanks for coming," I said, extending my hand. He shook it firmly. "No problem. What exactly did you see?" I kept my description factual, focusing on observable details. "Male subject, approximately 6 feet tall, loitering at the end of the fuel dock. Unusual appearance, possibly on drugs. Made concerning statements about swimming." Rob nodded, hand resting instinctively on his equipment belt. "Show me where." We walked together down the main dock, our breath forming twin clouds in the cold air. Rob moved with the practiced alertness of law enforcement, eyes constantly scanning, hand never far from his weapon. The wooden planks creaked beneath our combined weight. "Place gives me the creeps at night," he admitted quietly as we approached the fuel dock. "Something about marinas after dark, all those boats sitting empty in the water." I nodded, but said nothing. We reached the junction where the main dock met the fuel pier. Rob unclipped his flashlight, larger and brighter than mine, and swept the beam across the wooden walkway. "Stay here," he instructed, stepping onto the fuel dock alone. I watched as he made his way methodically to the end, checking behind fuel pumps and in the shadows between pilings. His movements were efficient, professional, the same search pattern I'd seen the Coast Guard use 2 nights before. After 5 minutes of thorough inspection, he returned, shaking his head. Nobody there now. No signs anyone's been there recently either. Frost is undisturbed except for your footprints and mine. I frowned, remembering the heel marks I'd seen earlier. There were boot prints in the frost before, fresh ones. Rob gave me a measuring look. "Working nights can play tricks on your mind, Tom. Especially in a place like this." He gestured at the surrounding darkness. "All this water, all these shadows, makes your brain fill in blanks that aren't there." We walked back to the office in silence. At the door, Rob paused. "Look, I know jobs are scarce right now, but have you thought about finding something with daylight hours? This kind of work." He glanced around the marina, expression unreadable. "It gets to people after a while." "I'm fine," I said, more defensively than I'd intended. "Just being cautious." Rob nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "Call me if you see anything else suspicious. Direct line, anytime." He handed me a business card with his cell number written on the back. "And maybe see if your boss will spring for a better security system. Cameras, motion sensors, that kind of thing." After he left, I locked the door and pulled the blinds closed. The logbook sat open on the desk, waiting for my hourly entries. I wrote, "Unusual subject observed at fuel dock. Police contacted. Nothing found." Then closed the book. The wall clock ticked steadily toward 1 a.m. My next patrol would be due soon, but the thought of returning to those docks made my skin crawl. Instead, I checked each window lock twice, then positioned my chair against the far wall, facing the door. Daniel's note crinkled in my pocket. "Trust the rules," he'd written. But the rules felt increasingly inadequate against whatever waited in the darkness outside. The man with the mirror eyes had said it himself. Rules can only protect you for so long. The rest of my shift stretched before me, 7 more hours until dawn. I stared at the phone, wondering if I should call Daniel. But what would I say? That I'd seen a man with impossible eyes who knew about the woman with red hair? That both of them seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to break the rules that kept them at bay? Instead, I opened my book and tried to focus on the words, keeping one ear tuned to any sounds from outside. But the marina remained utterly, unnaturally silent, as if holding its breath for whatever might come next. I hadn't slept all day. The blinds in my apartment couldn't block enough sunlight to fool my body into thinking it was night. Every time I drifted off, I'd jerk awake seconds later, convinced someone was watching me. By 7 in the evening, I'd given up entirely and made a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint. The drive to Acadia Marina felt longer than usual. My headlights caught patches of early November frost already forming on the roadside grass. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read 31 degrees. The heater in my Civic worked overtime, but couldn't quite keep up with the cold air seeping through worn door seals. I arrived 20 minutes early and parked at the far end of the gravel lot, keeping the engine running while I gathered my resolve. The marina looked deceptively normal. Security lights casting yellow pools on the dock, boats gently rocking at their moorings, the office windows glowing with warmth. Normal until you knew what to look for. At 10:45, I killed the engine and made the walk to the office. Each step on the gravel sounded unnaturally loud in the still air. I unlocked the door quickly, stepped inside, and secured the deadbolt behind me. The night shift logbook sat open on the desk, yesterday's entries staring back at me. I'd skipped the 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. patrols entirely, marking them as completed, regardless. Those weren't lies I could maintain forever. Daniel would notice eventually, if he hadn't already. I positioned my chair away from the windows, made fresh coffee, and checked my watch. 11:17. First patrol would start at midnight, assuming I could force myself out the door. The coffee machine gurgled and hissed as it finished brewing. I poured a cup and wrapped both hands around it, absorbing the warmth. My left forearm still showed 4 small crescent marks where the red-haired woman's nails had dug into my skin. Not deep enough to break skin, but the bruises had darkened to a purple blue overnight. Time passed with excruciating slowness. I checked and rechecked the office door's deadbolt, tested the windows to confirm they were locked, placed my flashlight, phone, and keys in precise positions on the desk where I could grab them instantly. At 11:58, I stood and put on my jacket. The first patrol couldn't be avoided without risk of Daniel discovering I wasn't doing my job. I'd take the shortest possible route, main dock only, no branches or extensions, keeping the office in sight at all times. The night air hit my face like a slap when I stepped outside. 27 degrees according to the thermometer mounted by the door. Stars glittered overhead in a cloudless sky, and a half moon cast enough light that I barely needed my flashlight. The wooden planks of the main dock creaked under my boots. 50 yards out, then 50 yards back. 5 minutes at most. I walked briskly, flashlight beam sweeping methodically ahead of me. Everything appeared normal. No unusual sounds, no movement beyond the gentle lapping of water against pilings. I reached the midpoint of the dock and paused, scanning the water in both directions. The moonlight created a bright streak across the harbor's surface, illuminating a line of mooring buoys that stretched into the distance. Nothing seemed out of place. That's when I smelled it. Copper and seaweed. The same scent that had surrounded the red-haired woman the night before. I turned slowly, flashlight raised. They stood 20 feet behind me, blocking my return path to the office. The red-haired woman wore a dark peacoat that reached her knees. Her hair caught the moonlight, glowing like burnished copper. Beside her, the man with the strange eyes wore what looked like a fisherman's rubber overalls, too large for his frame. Both stood perfectly still, watching me with identical expressions of patient interest. "Evening," the woman called, her voice pleasant and ordinary. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" I said nothing, calculating distances and options. The dock was 8 feet wide, too narrow to go around them. Behind me lay another 30 yards of main dock before it ended at open water. No exits, no alternate routes. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday," she continued, taking a small step forward. Her movements seemed more natural tonight, less mechanical. "I was having a terrible day and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair." The man beside her remained motionless except for his smile, which widened incrementally as she spoke. His eyes reflected my flashlight beam with that unnatural silver sheen, like an animal's eyes in headlights. "I need to finish my patrol," I said, voice steadier than I felt. "If you'll excuse me." I took a step to the right, intending to squeeze past them along the edge of the dock. Both shifted simultaneously to block my path, moving with precise coordination. "Don't be rude," the woman said, smile still fixed in place. "I'm trying to apologize. The least you could do is acknowledge it." The man finally spoke, his voice like metal scraping against metal. "We just want to talk. Is that so much to ask?" His eyes seemed to grow larger as he spoke, the silver reflection intensifying. I took a step backward. "I'm working. I need to get back to the office." "Always in such a hurry," the woman sighed. Her face shifted subtly, the angles of her cheekbones becoming too sharp, her smile stretching wider than humanly possible. "Always hiding behind those rules." I backed up another step. "Please move aside." "Or what?" She tilted her head at an unnatural angle. "You'll call your friend with the badge again?" He can't see us unless we want to be seen." They advanced in perfect unison, closing the distance between us to 15 feet. The woman's fingers flexed at her sides, nails visibly lengthening into curved points. "The rules only work if you follow all of them," the man said, his grin revealing too many teeth, each one needle sharp. "You've already broken 2. I continued backing away, mind racing. What rules had I broken? I hadn't responded to cries from the water. I'd followed my patrol route, mostly. I'd avoided the red-haired woman. I'd tried not to look at the man's eyes. The woman lunged forward suddenly, covering 10 feet in a single fluid movement that wasn't quite a leap and wasn't quite a step. Her hand shot out and clamped around my left forearm, fingers digging in with impossible strength. The nails pierced my jacket sleeve and broke skin beneath. "Got you," she whispered, face inches from mine. This close, I could see that her pupils were vertical slits, like a cat's. No more running away. I wrenched backward, tearing my arm from her grip. Something ripped. My sleeve, her nails, my skin, and warmth trickled down my wrist. Without thinking, I swung the heavy flashlight in a wide arc that caught her across the shoulder. She hissed, the sound more reptilian than human. The impact should have knocked her down, but she merely rocked back slightly, eyes widening with something like delight. "Oh, he wants to play rough," she said to her companion. "I like that." I turned and ran toward the end of the dock, away from the office. It was the wrong direction for safety, but my only option with them blocking the path back. My boots pounded against the wooden planks. Behind me came their footsteps, too light, too quick, almost skipping across the surface. The dock ended 30 yards ahead in a small platform with a navigation light. No exit there, just open water. I glanced back over my shoulder. They followed at a measured pace, neither running nor walking, but moving with a gliding motion that ate up the distance between us. The woman's mouth had opened in a wide grin that split her face nearly ear to ear. The man's eyes had grown to cover almost half his face, glowing silver in the moonlight. 10 yards from the dock's end, I cut sideways and vaulted over the railing. The fall was only 6 feet, but the shock of the cold water drove the breath from my lungs. My boots hit the rocky bottom, sinking ankle-deep in silt. The water reached my chest, soaking through my jacket instantly. 42 degrees, according to yesterday's logbook measurement. Hypothermia temperature. I fought through the thigh-deep water, angling toward the shore where a narrow strip of rocky beach ran alongside the Marina property. Behind me, I heard a splash, just one, as something entered the water. The shoreline seemed impossibly far. Each step required fighting against the water's resistance, my waterlogged boots slipping on underwater rocks. My hands had already gone numb and the cold burned through my clothes like acid. I risked a glance backward. The woman stood on the dock, watching me with that impossible grin, making no move to follow. In the water behind me, something dark cut the surface, not swimming but gliding just beneath, leaving a V-shaped wake. The shore was 20 feet away now, 15, 10. My legs had lost most feeling, moving on pure adrenaline and survival instinct. 5 feet from safety, something brushed against my calf, a hand with too many joints grasping at my pant leg. I kicked hard and lunged forward, scrambling onto the rocky shore on hands and knees. I staggered to my feet and ran along the shoreline toward the office, each step sending spikes of pain through my frozen feet. Water streamed from my clothes, leaving a clear trail behind me. The gravel parking lot appeared ahead, then the side entrance to the office. A shape detached from the shadows beside the building, the woman somehow ahead of me despite having stayed on the dock. I changed direction, skidding on wet gravel, and sprinted for the front entrance instead. My frozen fingers fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to jam the right one into the lock. I threw myself through the door and slammed it shut, turning the deadbolt just as something heavy crashed against the outer surface. The entire frame shuddered with the impact. I backed away, leaving puddles on the linoleum floor. Through the window, I saw them both outside, the woman directly in front of the door, the man circling toward the side of the building. They moved with predatory patience, unhurried but relentless. "Let us in, Thomas," the woman called, her voice muffled but perfectly audible through the glass. "We just want to talk." I staggered to the bathroom, stripped off my soaked jacket, and grabbed the stack of clean towels from the shelf. My hands shook violently as I tried to dry myself. The cut on my arm had stopped bleeding, leaving a streak of pink-tinged water down to my wrist. Something scraped against the side window, fingernails or claws dragging across the glass. I wrapped a towel around my shoulders and moved away from the windows, positioning myself against the back wall where I couldn't be seen from outside. "Thomas," came a voice from the direction of the water. The same drowning cry I'd heard before, but now with my name attached to it. "Help me, Thomas. I'm drowning. Please help me." A different sound came from the front window, a soft thump as something pressed against the glass. I edged forward just enough to see. The man with the strange eyes had his face flattened against the window, those silver discs staring unblinkingly into the office. His hands were splayed on either side of his head, fingers too long and jointed in the wrong places. His breath fogged the glass in perfect circles that expanded and contracted with rhythmic precision. For 2 hours they continued their siege. The woman alternated between calling in that drowning voice from the harbor and pounding on the doors. The man remained at the window, face pressed to the glass, watching with those unblinking silver eyes. Occasionally, one would disappear briefly, only to reappear at a different window or door. At 2:58, according to the wall clock, they suddenly stopped. The woman's cries cut off mid-sentence. The man's face vanished from the window. The silence felt more threatening than the noise had been. I crept to the front window and peered through a gap in the blinds. They stood side by side on the main dock, facing the office. As I watched, they turned in perfect unison and walked toward the water at the dock's edge. No hesitation, no pause. They stepped off the wooden planks and into the harbor, disappearing beneath the surface without creating so much as a ripple. I remained frozen in place for several minutes, waiting for them to reappear. The harbor stayed calm, its surface undisturbed except for the gentle lapping of water against the pilings. My clothes had dried somewhat, but cold had settled deep in my bones. I changed into the spare shirt and pants I kept in the office closet, then made fresh coffee with hands that still trembled slightly. The logbook sat open on the desk, waiting for my entries. I picked up the pen, hesitated, then wrote, 1 a.m. patrol completed, all secure. The lie felt heavy as I wrote it, but what was the alternative? Explaining that I'd been chased by 2 creatures pretending to be human? I added a second entry. 3 a.m. Unusual subjects observed on property. Departed without incident. The wall clock read 3:17. 4 more hours until dawn. I wedged a chair under the doorknob, double-checked every window lock, and positioned myself where I could see all potential entry points. The coffee grew cold in my mug as I watched the darkness outside, waiting for any sign of movement. None came. As the first gray light of dawn broke over the eastern horizon, I allowed myself to relax fractionally. I completed a final patrol, my first real one of the night, finding nothing out of place except a set of wet footprints on the main dock that ended abruptly halfway along its length. Daniel arrived at 7:05, his truck tires crunching on the gravel outside. I gathered my things quickly, eager to leave but unsure what to tell him. The 4 crescent-shaped punctures on my arm had scabbed over, barely visible unless you knew to look for them. "Morning," he said as he entered, eyes immediately taking in my substitute clothes and the dark circles under my eyes. "Everything go all right last night?" I hesitated, the weight of what I'd experienced pressing against my chest like a stone. "I need to talk to you about something," I said finally. "About the rules." Daniel's expression shifted, a mixture of resignation and grim understanding crossing his weathered face. "Yes," he said quietly. "I expect you do." I sat in the office chair until dawn, keeping my back to the wall and my eyes on the door. Each minute stretched into what felt like hours. The coffee machine had run dry around 4. I didn't make more. Caffeine wouldn't help the tremors in my hands anyway. The first pale gray light filtered through the blinds at 5:43. Birds began calling outside, normal birds with normal sounds. The dark water beyond the docks gradually shifted from black to slate gray. A lobster boat chugged past the harbor entrance, running lights still visible in the half-light. I watched all this through gaps in the blinds, never moving from my position against the wall. My damp clothes had dried stiff with salt. The 4 puncture wounds on my arm throbbed in time with my pulse. At 6:15, I picked up the phone and called Daniel. The line rang 3 times before he answered, voice alert despite the early hour. "Something's wrong," he said. Not a question. "Yes." My voice came out hoarse from hours of disuse. "Can you come now? I need to talk to you." 20 minutes, he replied and hung up. I used those 20 minutes to write my final logbook entry. All secure at dawn, no further incidents. The pen shook in my grip, making the words jagged across the page. Daniel's truck pulled into the lot at 6:37. He walked briskly to the office, not the usual measured pace of a man in his 70s, but the purposeful stride of someone responding to an emergency. He unlocked the door without knocking. We looked at each other for a long moment. His eyes took in my substitute clothes, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I held myself against the wall. "They came for you," he said flatly. I nodded, throat tight. "Both of them?" "Yes. The woman with red hair and the man with the eyes." I swallowed hard. They knew my name. Daniel sighed heavily and locked the door behind him. He walked to the coffee machine, found it empty, and began preparing a fresh pot with mechanical efficiency. "Tell me everything," he said, measuring grounds into the filter. "Start at the beginning of your shift." I recounted the night's events in sequential order, focusing on observable details. The way they had blocked my path on the dock, the woman's nails lengthening into claws, my escape into the harbor waters, their siege of the office, how they had vanished beneath the water's surface without a ripple. Daniel listened without interruption, face growing grimmer with each detail. When the coffee finished brewing, he poured 2 mugs and handed one to me. His weathered hands were steady. "Show me your arm," he said. I pushed up my sleeve, revealing the 4 crescent-shaped punctures where her nails had broken skin. Daniel nodded as if confirming something he already knew. "You'll want to clean those again when you get home. Salt water and peroxide, then antibiotic ointment. Change the bandage twice daily." "What are they?" I asked, the question that had built inside me all night finally breaking free. Daniel looked toward the window, eyes fixed on the harbor beyond. "Sit down," he said. "This will take some explaining." I lowered myself into the chair across from him, muscles aching from hours of tension. "This land wasn't always a marina," Daniel began, voice matter-of-fact. "Back in 1847, there was a fishing village here. Maybe 20 families. Good harbor, protected from the worst northeasterly storms." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "In October that year, a storm came that nobody expected. Hit at night, rose so fast the village didn't have time to prepare. 12 boats were lost, 37 people drowned. They rebuilt elsewhere. But this harbor," he gestured toward the window. "Some places hold on to things." "Things," I repeated. "You mean people, ghosts?" Daniel shook his head once, definitively. "Not ghosts, not people either. Something else that was here before the village, before any of us." the storm just gave them more to work with. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. They're drawn to boundaries, places where land meets water, where life meets death. They feed on attention, on interaction. Every time someone acknowledges them, responds to them, they get stronger. The coffee tasted bitter in my mouth. The rules. Yes, Daniel nodded. The rules aren't arbitrary. They're protection. Don't respond to calls from the water. That's how they lure you in. Follow the patrol route exactly. It was mapped to avoid their strongest areas. Don't engage with the red-haired woman or the man with strange eyes. They're the most dangerous, the ones who've learned to mimic humans most effectively. You said they feed on interaction. I set my mug down carefully. What happens if someone gives them what they want? Daniel's expression darkened. Before I took over as night watchman, there was a college kid working summers. Nice boy, studying marine biology. One night in July, he heard someone calling for help from the water. He took the Marina dinghy out to investigate. Daniel paused. They never found his body, just the empty boat, drifting near the harbor entrance at dawn. I thought about the desperate cries I'd heard my first week. How close I'd come to breaking that first rule. I've been the night watchman here for 20 years, Daniel continued. Kept the rules, kept myself safe. Barely, some nights. But my wife passed last spring. And at 72, he shrugged. These old bones can't handle the night shift anymore. So you hired me, I said, the pieces falling into place, without telling me what I was really guarding against. Daniel met my eyes without flinching. Would you have believed me? If I'd told you the truth during that interview? I couldn't honestly say yes. I did what I could, he said. Gave you the rules. They've kept me alive 2 decades. They would have kept you safe too if you'd followed them all. A flush of anger warmed my face. I did follow them. Did you? Daniel's gaze was steady. You skipped patrols. You marked them completed in the logbook, but you didn't do them, breaking the second rule about following the route exactly. The lie I'd written in the logbook stared back at me from the open page. I had no defense. And last night, when the man spoke to you, you looked at his eyes, didn't you? Even for a moment. I swallowed hard, remembering the silver discs reflecting my flashlight beam. Maybe. I don't know. It happened fast. Daniel nodded. That's all it takes. A single glance, a moment of direct engagement. They've got your scent now, and they won't easily let it go. We sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the gentle ticking of the wall clock and the distant cry of gulls outside. The harbor had fully awakened now, sunlight sparkling on the water's surface as if nothing horrific lurked beneath. I'm giving you a choice, Daniel said finally. 2 options. I waited, hands clasped tightly around my coffee mug. First option, you walk away. I'll pay you for 2 weeks. $1,400 cash. You leave today and never come back to this marina. Not ever, for any reason. If you stay away, they won't follow you. And the second option? You stay. Continue as night watchman, but with full knowledge of what you're facing. I'll increase your pay to $150 per night. An extra $50 each shift, $350 more per week. Enough to catch up on my overdue rent. Maybe even start paying down my credit card debt. If I stay, I said carefully, will they keep coming for me? Daniel's expression was grave. They'll test you. Push at the boundaries. Try to make you break the rules again. But if you're vigilant, if you follow every rule precisely, he spread his hands. I survived 20 years. Barely, I echoed his earlier word. Some nights. He didn't contradict me. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the marina in morning light. The boats bobbed gently at their moorings, serene and ordinary. Fishermen moved about their vessels, preparing for the day ahead. A harbor seal surfaced briefly near one of the outer buoys, sleek head glistening before disappearing again. $1,400 would cover my rent for a month, maybe stretch to 6 weeks if I cut every possible expense. Then what? Back to sending out resumes, competing against hundreds of other applicants for every entry-level position. But $150 a night meant $750 per week, $3,000 per month, all in cash. Financial breathing room I hadn't had in years. All I had to do was spend 7 hours each night in a place where things that weren't human waited in the darkness, watching for me to make a mistake. "Can I ask you something?" I turned back to Daniel. "Why keep this place open at all? Why not sell the marina? Let someone tear it down and build condos or whatever." Daniel's smile held no humor. "You think concrete and steel would stop them? You think they'd just disappear if we filled in this harbor?" He shook his head. "Better to have this place with its rules and boundaries. Better to have someone like me, like you, who knows what to watch for." I looked back at the water, weighing terror against necessity. The sun had fully risen now, turning the harbor's surface to hammered gold. As I watched, something pale broke the water near the end of the main dock. Not a seal this time. A hand, fingers splayed, reaching upward for a moment before sinking silently beneath the surface. My breath caught in my throat. Daniel stood beside me, following my gaze. "They're always there," he said quietly, "day and night. But they're strongest after dark when the boundaries blur." I thought about my dwindling bank account, my maxed out credit card, the stack of rejection letters from job applications, the growing hollowness in my stomach that came from stretching every meal as far as possible. I thought about the woman's claws piercing my skin, the man's silver eyes expanding to fill his face, the way they had stepped off the dock in perfect unison, disappearing beneath the water without a ripple. "I'll stay," I said finally, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "But I want something else besides the extra $50. Daniel raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I want to know everything, all of it. Not just the rules, but what they are, why they're here, how they work. If I'm risking my life every night, I deserve to understand exactly what I'm facing." Daniel studied me for a long moment, measuring something in my face or voice. Then he nodded once, decisively. "Fair enough. I'll tell you what I know." He gestured to the chairs. "It's a longer conversation than we have time for now. Come by my house at 2 this afternoon, up on the hill behind the marina, the white 2-story you can see from here." I nodded, suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion pressing down on me. 24 hours without sleep, most of them spent in a state of hypervigilance, had left me hollow. "Get some rest first," Daniel said, reading my condition accurately. "You'll need your wits about you to understand what we're dealing with." He paused. "And Thomas? From now on, follow every rule, exactly as written. No exceptions, no matter what you see or hear." I left the marina as the morning sun cleared the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot. In my rearview mirror, the harbor water sparkled innocently, revealing nothing of what lurked beneath its surface. Some jobs came with obvious dangers: construction accidents, chemical exposures, workplace injuries. Others hid their hazards behind ordinary facades, revealing them only when you were already in too deep to easily walk away. As I drove home, the woman's words echoed in my head. Rules can only protect you for so long. I wondered if Daniel had told me everything, or if there were truths about Acadia Marina darker than even he would admit.